What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how we're thinking about acquisition flows and how we're building them out, as well as the metrics and data that we've collected in terms of the acquisition flows that we have been working on. So this is going to be a bit of a deep dive, and it's something that I'm super excited to talk about, just to switch things up a little bit and basically just to talk about acquisition flows, because I think this is super important, especially just diving deep into it and solely just understanding what it is that acquisition flows entails, both internally and externally. So with the mission of these videos is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, to show the mental models that we're using today and frameworks so that we can scale them up into the future, and to solve big problems where it hurts within businesses and organizations, and to call in visionaries, basically people that understand what it is that we're doing, and also just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So how I'm actively building this lead gen machine, as you would say, is in 5 simple steps. So as usual, with number one being the multi-channel outreach. Why this is important is ultimately one channel is a gamble, so it's like putting all of your eggs in one basket. Your ICP, your ideal customer profile, is scrolling on X, checking LinkedIn, skimming emails. So basically understanding that they're on 3 separate platforms, but also understanding that within those 3 separate platforms there's one specific platform that they're always going to be checking, and for us it's emails. So that's why we're now rolling out, but really diving deep in terms of understanding what it is that we need to do in terms of emails, and just going full on in terms of emails as well, and just hitting on different fronts when it is required, using different sequence flows that we're actively testing out in this current present moment in time, and just understanding the data as well as to what's working, what's not working. And with this, how we're actively doing this, we're using Lemlist, so 50 cold emails a day to luxury planners. So we have 2 separate sequence flows that we're actively implementing, because we have 2 separate offers. We have an intro offer, then we have the fully custom built offer. Because one of the things that I realized is that most of the things that we have been doing, we can hit them on 2 fronts, so that we understand that we can have an intro offer that gets them into our ecosystem, and then from there we can upsell them. So solely just having those two different sequences, we've been testing it out. So that's why it says 50 cold outreach emails a day on each sequence, to say, hey, our current reply rate for the new copy that we've literally just tested out is 4%. So this is something that we've actively just implemented now. Our response rate so this is basically people getting back to us is 4%, but the goal for these ones, the one that we're rolling out specifically for our intro offer, is 10 to 15%. So the one that we have for our back end upsell is ultimately gonna come in from this intro offer. So we're basically just gonna feed in the from this intro offer into our backend fully custom built solution, and basically saying, hey, on X we're sharing the build to connect with high level founders. We just ultimately just want to make sure that we're hitting on all fronts, and also just understanding feedback from different angles. So that's why we're hitting on all fronts, basically connecting with high level founders on LinkedIn or X, and saying, hey, reply to their tweets with value and start conversations, because within conversations you ultimately just pick up nuggets that you wouldn't have picked up if you don't start those conversations. And ultimately understanding chaos from different perspectives also just helps you understand this big picture model that you can use to basically better the product that we're actively building. Because for us, we're building a product, we're building a machine, and we just always want to actively be refining the machine and learning as much as possible, so that we can implement what it is that we're learning from the feedback, and just build better products. And how we're hitting this up on LinkedIn is basically 10 DMs a day to our ICP with 500 plus connections. Pretty standard to say, hey, we need to have a minimum threshold, because these people are also connected within their specific ecosystem. And if they have 500 plus people, that means that, hey, if we help these people out, they probably have way more people within their ecosystem that we can also help out. And just solely just understanding that by also just filtering event planning keywords to say, hey, we want to dial in our outreach as much as possible by making sure that we're getting the right person that we understand they're paying for, and we're not just scattering around in terms of saying, hey, we're just targeting XYZ, but we're not niching down or getting as specific as possible, because we need to also understand that we want to work with a specific client avatar and actively just build for that. And saying, hey, the tactic that we're using is connection request plus reply. So my framework around this, and I'll probably just chat about it in a different video, is the tap 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 knock method, where you tap 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 and then you knock. So basically provide value 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 and then ask for something, but basically saying, hey, let's provide value 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 and then ask, because if you do that, you're basically eroding, or you're getting rid of that trust gap. You adding to the trust gap, I mean, sorry, of saying, hey, we're actively building trust by providing value, and ultimately that's gonna make people become warm to working with you, and saying, hey, the biggest lesson that I've learned here is diversify or die. Meet your ICP where they live, basically understanding that, hey, our ICP spends 90% of their times on emails, so let's hit them on emails. But not only that, let's build on an acquisition flows that allows us to hit them on different fronts, but also not being too spammy. So giving delays, specific delays and triggers that we're going to be using on the back end to make sure that, hey, we're not being too spammy, but we're also making sure that we're hitting them so that they actively remember that we exist. And also just understanding, hey, we're using Apollo.io and data scraper to basically scrape data off of our ICP, saying, hey, event planners plus luxury, and then exporting this to a CVS files, and then split testing the channels. So basically split testing the channels as well, to say, hey, we have XYZ response rate for this channel, we have XYZ response rate for this channel. Because also ultimately just having the data in a spreadsheet or even just an Airtable, because we mainly just use Airtable for what it is that we do internally, to have that and just solely just understand the data ultimately allows you to have that feedback and mental models of understanding, hey, this is working, this is not what's working, let's test this, let's not test this. And then saying, hey, data driven subject lines. So this is also super important, to saying, hey, no opens, no replies, no money. You basically make no money, because you get no responses, and ultimately you're gonna need to use data. If you're just copying and pasting the same message all the time, ultimately you're gonna get the same data if you just keep on trying the same thing. But ultimately saying, hey, what I've picked up, or what at least what we've picked up, is saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're also just testing different subject lines, because different subject lines give you a perceived, or give you a indicator as to what is working within this specific niche, and if you understand their pain points to the level that you need to, because they're not going to respond if you're just being a general person saying, hey, we're doing what 10 other people have sent the same exact message. That is not going to work. So we're just ultimately just understanding the different subject lines and using data to power that in terms of our decision making, to say, hey, the data that we're using is based on A/B testing. So making sure that subject lines are the first, because subject lines are the first touch point that we're gonna have, and ultimately just understanding that allows us to then refine our process and saying, hey, A/B testing tested, hey, fix your 500k events chaos, 38% open. So 38% of those people open this specific subject line, and then saying, hey, save 20 hours a week on events, basically saying, hey, we've gotten 42% from this, and data picks the winner. So ultimately saying, if we get one that is 42% over one that is 38%, then hey, we have something to work off of, and then we're ultimately just going to use data in order to guide us in terms of what it is that we need to be implementing in terms of our subject lines. And also right now, what we've also implemented is custom headlines. So there's a sequence flow that we have implemented in terms of this, and we're actively testing, that has a 38% response rate, which is basically customizing to that specific ICP's needs. So saying, hey, we're going on the website, and then we're actively just getting data from that on saying, hey, we need to personalize this as much as possible. And how can we do that? We need to study the business, and that takes a lot of time. So just ultimately just testing different things and understanding what has been working. For us, it's basically been implementing the save 20 hours per week, because ultimately by doing this, you ultimately understand that, hey, they want their time saved and they don't want to face chaos, rather than saying, hey, they want to save 20 hours a week, they want to buy back their time, over saying, hey, they want to make sure that they're saving 500k in their events chaos. And ultimately just understanding what is better to pick on that ultimately just allows you to then make the decision of saying, hey, we need to go with number two, not number one, in terms of our subject line, and then ultimately just build around that. And saying, hey, Lemlist analytics tracking opens, replies, clicks, open rates 40%, goal is 50% plus. Ultimately just saying, hey, we want to make sure that 50% plus of people are ultimately just opening. And then personalization, saying, hey, if we're sending this specific subject line because it works, then we're going to say, hey, added company name to chaos, and then company name, basically personalizing it, and then saying, hey, open rate jumped to 7% simply by personalizing it. Because if it doesn't feel personal to them, and they know that, hey, we've gotten this message before, or this message doesn't really hit us as hard, then they're not gonna respond. They're not gonna take the initiative to respond back. And that's something that we've ultimately just understood, and that we're actively implementing and testing out to say, hey, does this actively work? Does this not work? And then making sure that we're personalizing it, because if their pain point feels personal, and they're actively experiencing it, then they're obviously going to want to feed their pain, or basically have their pain removed. And saying, hey, the biggest lesson is test relentlessly, small tweaks, big wins. Ultimately just understanding that we need to make small tweaks, like the smallest tweaks ultimately can lead to the biggest wins that we have. And then deep cut, which is using NLP tools such as ChatGPT to generate 50 subject line variants, and then filter from emotional triggers, chaos, stress, wins. So basically just filtering them out, and just using these tools in order to help us guide the data that we're going to be using in terms of implementing these different strategies, which ultimately lead us to the third point, which is super important as well, scoring leads. And I'm not sure if a lot of people do this, but this is something that I am super bullish on in terms of lead scoring, to make sure that saying, hey, our time is limited. Use scoring to filter highest to close. So basically, who has the highest possibility of closing in terms of the touch points that we have gathered. So saying, hey, Airtable system, we built an internal Airtable system to say, hey, it ranks from 1 to 10, and the rules are pretty simple. Email response, have they opened the email? Cool, that's 1 plus. Have they responded? That's 3 plus. Have they engaged with us? Have they liked slash commented? So that's 2 plus. And have they booked books a call? So that's 7 plus. So making sure that we're scoring this, and then we're only actively hitting the people that have a high percentage. So saying, hey, only follow-ups with 7 plus scores, because they are most likely to close with us. Because if we're engaging with someone that has a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, they're less likely going to be to close, and they're going to need a bit more of a push. So saying, hey, maybe we need to push them through retargeting ads, or something specific that they're going to be needing, like a free resource as well. And just ultimately just understanding that, hey, if they have a 7 or 7 plus, then we need to make sure that we're actively hitting those people, because they show that they are experiencing the pain that we can actively solve for them. And saying, hey, cut a 20-hour work week into 5 of high ROI calls. So saying, instead of saying, hey, we need 20 hours per week on calls, let's cut that down to 5, because we're only just focusing on the people that are actively keen on working with us based on this lead scoring that we've had. Because it ultimately also just saves time to say, hey, we don't need to make sure that we need to make sure that we're spending our time and resources on the people that are actively engaged in what it is that we have to tell them. And saying, hey, an example of this is lead A, 3 opens, 1 reply equals 6, so nudge, so we can nudge. And then lead B, 2 opens, 1 reply, 1 call equals 10 priority. So basically ranking them, saying, hey, this one's lowest priority, this one's highest priority. And ultimately just allowing our team to understand that, hey, we need to make sure that we're hitting on all fronts in terms of who it is that we need to hit on our team, to say, hey, we need to make sure that we're hitting people that are 7 or 7 plus, because they have the highest intent on us helping them solve their problems. And saying, hey, the biggest lesson that we've learned here is relentless focus, score, rank, and close. So basically score, rank, and close process, to make sure that, hey, we're relentlessly focusing on what it is that we need to focus on, and we're not just shooting blank, because that is the worst thing that we could be doing, is shooting blank and not having a structured process around this. And saying, hey, deep cut, automate scoring with Zapier. Hey, saying, hey, Gmail open, +1 in Airtable. So making sure that we're just actively scoring the leads as we go, which ultimately allows us to then move to the fourth point, which is automating follow-ups, scale, persist. So basically saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're automating the follow-ups, so having different sequences and processes in place, saying, hey, why this is key is because 80% of sales need 5+ touches, like I mentioned in the beginning, to say, hey, people need to see you more than once to build that trust, and ultimately have you understanding that by saying, hey, we need to make sure that people understand or they see us from multiple different angles. Then the trust is built and formed over time. So for example, even having, even having, these YouTube videos, you ultimately just gain trust through that, and that is solely organic. And saying, hey, manual follow-ups don't scale, so basically ultimately just understanding that, hey, if we just do manual follow-ups, we can only hit so many per day. But if we automate this sequence and create an entire sequence for this whole process in terms of follow-ups, we can ultimately scale. And that is the number one thing that we want to do, is to ultimately scale our processes and procedures as well, to making sure that we're servicing the people that actively need it, and we're also actively reaching out to the people that are facing the problems that we're actively solving, and saying, hey, email sequence is 7-day cadence. So this is an entire email sequence flow that we have. So basically just a rundown of it is: day one, we basically say, hey, we've noticed XYZ. Then we move into the phase of saying, hey, are you sure, have you seen this? So basically backing it up with data and saying, hey, have you seen XYZ, have you done this? And then ultimately just a last nudge at the end of the day after 7 days, and then saying, hey, it's so sad to see you leave. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen those emails to say, hey, we just are so sad to see you leave, because responses come from 5+ touches. And ultimately having a sequence flow for us, what we have been doing and implementing is testing out having four sequence flows, and then four email follow-ups versus 8 email follow-ups, and seeing the data between that. What we have seen is that the one with eight email follow-ups has been the one that has yielded the highest percentage in terms of responses, and we're actively just implementing that because that is the winner. But yeah, we still have a lot to figure out in terms of that, but I'm sure like with time we're just ultimately just gonna hit the nail in the wall and just perfect it, and ultimately saying, hey, order triggers a lost shot email if no reply after 7 days. So basically, if no one follows up or replies within those 7 days, then we ultimately just say, hey, this lead is lost, or we're just gonna put this lead on somewhere where we're gonna keep them, but later on down the line we're gonna hit them up. But for now, let's just put them on the back burner, and saying, hey, stats: 60% of replies come from after touch. So basically saying, hey, we're hitting 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and then we're getting responses, because we may not get the first response, say, hey, it ends up in the junk mail, or the second response, they see it, then boom, we've already got a follow-up that we can actively say, hey, they responded because they saw the second email, or they opt out. Because another thing is, you don't want to make sure that you're being too spammy, and I think this is why you add delays, specific delays, and saying, hey, 3-4 days in terms of reaching out, and saying, hey, the biggest lesson that we've learned here is system beat hustle. So just manually hustling and just emailing and sending messages manually. We need to have systems and procedures in place on the back end, ensuring that, hey, we're ultimately just scaling our outreach, and we're not just hitting one person and then ultimately that person says no, and then what else are we going to do? So putting our eggs all in one basket, we're not doing that. We're actively just saying, hey, we need to make sure that our email sequence flow is super dialed and super nailed down in terms of the messaging, the positioning, and the pain points, as well as personalization, making sure that, hey, we're actively personalizing our email outreach to the person that needs to hear it, so that we're actively hitting on their pain that they're actively experiencing, because we understand that. And then saying, hey, the deep cut is adding conditional logic if they open but don't reply. I think this is also super important, just adding conditional logic, because you will get scenarios where you have specific flows that you're going to be having to implement. Say someone opens it but they don't reply, but then 2 days after they open it, but then reply. So are you going to really get rid of that lead after the last day, and then actively just having those processes in place and procedures in place ultimately just allows us to then refine the process, which ultimately leads to the fifth and final point, which is super important in terms of just having dashboards and optimization, just basically optimizing each and every metrics and data, because guessing is for losers. Data tells you what's working, what's not. And I think for me personally, I'm a big believer on using data to guide our use and our mental models and what it is that we're actively building on a day-to-day basis, to making sure that hey, we're actively using mental models based off of data, because data is going to guide us, instead of saying hey, we're just going to make an assumption and we're going to use this assumption to build very important things, and then you find out later down the line that you've been wasting so much time when you could have just gathered data by just doing it, and then ultimately using that data to guide what it is that you're doing in terms of acquisition flows. And then saying hey, we built a dashboard saying hey, inputs, video views 44,000, xdm sent, lemlist replies, what is the data basically looking like, what are the outputs, calls booked 5 per week equals 10, which we want to have 10, sorry. Sorry. But anyways, yeah, so basically saying hey, we want to move from 5 to 10 calls per week, and ultimately just having that done and understanding what it is that we can actively implement on Airtable, and just having that data there so that we can then optimize, and then saying hey, so xdm speeds email replies 2 to 1, double down there to basically say hey, we're having more success specifically on X, so now let's jump into X, or we're having more success specifically on emails, so let's jump to emails, and just using granular tweaks. Example saying hey, we upped email sends from 50 to 100 per day, so just scaling up email outreach to making sure that we're gathering even more data, because what happens at 50%, at 50 emails per day, won't necessarily happen at 100. You'll get more data, but you'll also learn a lot more. So just basically saying hey, we need to up what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, and slowly just understanding that, and then saying hey, the biggest lesson that we've learned from here is measure everything, optimize what moves the needle. Basically saying hey, we need to make sure that we're learning as much as we possibly can, and also just optimizing what moves the needle, basically understanding what moves the needle, getting the data, and then understanding how to actively use that data is another point for another day, to saying hey, we need to understand how this data is acting and how to actively implement it in what it is that we're building, and just saying hey, use Mixpanel to track funnel drop offs, views, DMs, calls, pinpoint leaks fast. So basically just using data in terms of understanding where in the funnel process are we losing, or are we having a drop off that leads us to then taking action, because that data is ultimately just going to guide our thinking and our approach to how we build out the funnel. Are we using A/B testing in terms of the funnel? Is it the messaging? Is it the positioning? Just ultimately understanding what it is that we need to build out in terms of our acquisition channels, and just solely just understanding how to build out better acquisition flows as well, and where we need to refine it, because the number one thing is just build it, tweak it, and then just build it, release it, and iterate on it, and then tweak it after. So basically just understanding that flow, and just understanding what it is that we need to be actively implementing on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, this is just my take on it. I've just personally just have been building these out, and just slowly just understanding more in the trenches. So take my word with a grain of salt, but this is what we have been building out in terms of acquisition flows, and my thought process in terms of building these out. And I know that into the future we're only just going to scale up how we actively building out these acquisition flows, and just actively learning from it, because number one as well for me is just actively learning from these videos as well, just how to message and position better, and just ultimately just to build better products by building these things, and just ultimately just refining the process, so that in the future we can look back and say hey, this is how we were thinking about acquisition flows in this specific point in time. Now let's scale that up and go even deeper, and ultimately just understanding that. And I know that into the future we're just only going to use these videos as a springboard. So I'm super excited to continue building new and better acquisition flows, and diving super deep in the trenches like always on these specific acquisition flows. And we're just going to be building more and more into the future, and I'm super excited to share the data that we're going to be gathering more and more as we scale even more in terms of our outreach strategies and our acquisition flows. So I'm super excited, and I can't wait to show you guys even more what's going to be happening in the future. If we do tweak this, I am going to be making sure to update you guys as well, to making sure that you guys know what it is that we're actively implementing and what it is that we're doing internally and externally as well. So yeah, I'm super excited, and I will see you guys in the next video. If you guys want to connect with me, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and make sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.